Yep. We're here for part five. I was not lying when I said this is going to be a million of them. And so, looking at the impacts of World War II in Europe, and because you've seen them so many times before, I'm not going to show you the learning outcomes, just jumping into it. And of course, in addition to the social and economic impacts, there were far reaching political impacts. So, if you remember, hopefully you do, what the map of Europe looked like in 1918. So, of course, we have the formation of new countries as a result of those Paris Peace Treaties of 1918. And you will be noticing a change after the Paris Peace Treaties of 1947. Yay! So, one of the biggest things that you can see, of course, is this is Europe in 1948. Germany is still occupied. So, in the French zone, US zone, British zone, and Soviet zone, Poland has been shifted over. You can see the former demarcations of Poland. And you can also see, like, for example, Austria is still is occupied, and but by the end of 1947, all of the other countries have essentially been set up as independent states. You should also see, just basically spend some time looking at the map, comparing, contrasting the two, and seeing the changes that have occurred politically as a result of these Paris Peace Treaties in 47. Now, additionally, other political changes that happened is Europe ceases to be the center of the world. And when I say center here, I mean quote unquote center. It is no longer the political heavyweight that it used to be. And it is no longer the economic heavyweight that it used to be. So your great European powers of Britain and France, especially, and then, and sort of the chessboard thing that was happening since the mid 1800s of like the great powers of Europe, that ceases to exist. These countries, Britain and France, were weakened severely economically. As stated previously, their treasuries were empty, and they had large debts from fighting the war. So, because they are so diminished economically, and with these large debts, they are not, they do not have the level of influence that they exercised prior to World War II. And so instead, what you start seeing is the ascendancy of the US. The US was the only great power, or the only, no, I don't want to say great power, but the only significant political power in this whole World War II thing that wasn't negatively affected, really. There were no bombings of American cities. American industry continued to grow, so on and so forth. And so, what you see here, leaving World War II, the U.S. is essentially the only state that has money to bankroll all of these, like the Marshall Plan, and that means because at this point the U.S. has the money, it becomes more powerful, more influential in global politics. And the thing that happens, especially, is the extension of the Soviet sphere of influence throughout Eastern Europe. Basically, the areas that the Soviet Union liberated from German control or Axis control, the Red Army stayed there. The Red Army camped out, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But now the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union is throughout all of Eastern Europe, and we will have a change toward communism in this area. We have the creation of some new states. And this is going to be mostly in Africa and Asia. As European powers lose their influence, we have these new states coming into, being created. So here we have a handy dandy map of Eastern Europe that looks at the changes that the border changes, the political changes that occurred from 1938 to 1948. So overall, you can see that there is an expansion of Soviet influence eastward. We have Soviet satellite states of much of Eastern Europe. And then we also have the expansion, literal expansion of Soviet borders westward. Take a look at the shifting of borders between Poland and Germany. Essentially, a really large portion of Germany is lost. Spend a few minutes looking at this, just kind of, and noting down the changes. And which brings us to the next bit. All right. So one of the biggest things we have is Ethiopia, as stated before. As a result of the treaty, Italy loses her colonies in Africa. So Ethiopia is restored to her former state as a result of this. One of the biggest things that happens is there is this increased demand of independence from the colonies. Proto-independent movements had been established in a lot of African and Asian colonies at the end of World War I. Because in this case, a lot of people, like in the case of Britain and France, a huge portion of their fighting forces in World War I were from the colonies, and people went out and fought and then came back with this renewed sense of nationalism and desired sovereignty. And by the time we get to World War II now, we've had a couple of decades of the development of this. Now, again, the huge amount of French forces and British forces that fought World War II were people from these colonies. And people go home and they're like, listen, we just died on foreign soil, freeing Europe from this tyranny and from from this dictatorship, so that they can have democracy and stuff. And so people went home and they're like, it is our turn. It's just not fair, and it doesn't make sense. And so you have basically all of the countries throughout Africa and Asia demanding their independence. And so there's a creation of this quote unquote third world of non-aligned states. This happens more during the Cold War, in which these states said that they weren't going to pick sides. A lot of them did. They switched sides back and forth because, hey, if the USSR is offering money, I'ma take it. If the US is offering money, I'ma take it. So there's this creation of a third spoke in the wheel, so to speak, so instead of this dichotomy between communism and democracy stroke capitalism, now there is a third one of states saying that, they're not going to pick a side. We have the creation of the United Nations as a successor to the League of Nations. One of the things that there is a recognition that the world needs something like a League of Nations to provide a diplomatic forum between states, and also to deal with some of the things that states don't deal with sometimes. It's kind of like the UN often acts as peer pressure. And so, states be like, hey, you know what? You should treat your people with more human rights. And other states are like, I know, stop peer pressuring me. So there's this recognition that the League of Nations was a good idea. The way that it was structured was not so brilliant, but the need for it is there. And so you now have the United Nations instead. And so the charter is drafted in April 45, and the first meeting was in January 46. It has a similar, but with a wider mission than the League. Um, and the other thing is that, like, some of the mistakes that they learned from the League, like not having peacekeeping forces, not being able to enforce like embargoes and stuff like this, they provide the League with, they provide the UN with more mechanisms to try to enforce participation. Looking at a map of national independence in Africa, you can see essentially from the 50s onward, basically all of these countries are seeking independence. And as I stated previously, part of it is because you have these homegrown independence movements that are jump-started and energized by people returning from fighting in World War II. The other thing that, of course, happens is that the European countries are no longer able to administer their colonies, and that is the cost of maintaining the colonies. They don't have that money. And then, of course, the cost of trying to put down these independence movements, it's too massive. So they simply can't afford politically and economically, as well as socially, because the home populations want investment at home in their hands, not in attempting to maintain these colonies. And so because of all of these things, they simply cannot do it. And so there are demonstrations, there are wars, and so on and so forth. But essentially, all of the former colonies of the European powers become independent. Which brings us to a map of Asia. I put this here. We'll talk about it in greater detail when we talk about World War II in Asia. But just to kind of see as well that this trend is happening in Africa, but also happening in Western Asia, which was largely under European control, and then East, and then from Central down to out to East Asia, which was the European control of their colonies was disrupted by Japan during the interwar. And so, yay! Your favorite part. Here is a red question. So take a bit of time, either pause the video, because, come on now. Pause the video, take a bit of time, and go back to your notes about the territorial changes that occurred at the end of World War I, and compare and contrast them to what we just talked about and what we looked at the end of World War II. Again, you are often asked a question about to compare and contrast the impacts, and so this would fall down under political impacts. Yay! One of the most politically significant results of World War II was the Nuremberg Trials. And so the Nuremberg Trials was the prosecution of the political, military, and economic leaders of Nazi Germany. And they decided to hold the Nuremberg Trials at Nuremberg because Nuremberg had been one of these really important political sites for the Nazis. So yearly they would have these big pageants and parades showing their military strength, drumming up support, basically a show for the people. And so the trials were held there kind of as part of that denazification and an indication that that this greatness, which Nuremberg had been used for, has been toppled down. And so from the onset, there were issues with the Nuremberg trials because they could only punish the violations of international law and war. So Some things came to law afterward, but so they were somewhat limited. There's some controversy over the legitimacy, essentially because similar crimes were committed by the Allied powers. How can you be punishing people for war crimes when you yourself participated in these war crimes? And a lot of this came from the Red Army from the Soviet Union. So you have this forced labor, which is slavery. The Red Army basically raped and pillaged their way westward. Yeah, westward, and the targets were German women and other ethnic groups that they didn't agree with. So using rape as a mechanism of war is illegal, but they couldn't punish the Soviet Union because they were allies. And then, of course, you have the crimes of aggression of Germany against Poland, but again, the Soviet Union is not punished for what they did against the Polish people. We talked about the Katia Forest massacre. Initially, Russia blamed it on the Germans for, I think it's something along the lines of like 40,000 people or 20,000 people, you know me in numbers, were taken out into the forest, and they dug their own graves and then were killed. And so Russia kind of covers it up, and there's no mention about it. So the validity of the legitimacy of these trials, of the people who are in effect deciding the outcomes themselves being war criminals. So here we go. Defendants, image of the Nuremberg Trials with the defendants guarded by American military police. So as we said, that the Soviet Union submitted false documentation of the massacre, essentially saying that they had nothing to do with it. And it wasn't really, of course, people suspected and people knew, but it wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union did, I guess, real documentation come out. There are translation issues. Because most of the people participating didn't share a common language, so it was the idea that maybe the information that was being used to deliberate upon was not well translated or didn't accurately reflect what people were attempting to say. But one of the things about the Nuremberg trials is that this is an attempt at providing fairness to the losers, that they had a trial, that people were able to present evidence in their defense, means that unlike at the end of World War I, when Kaiser Wilhelm I was just labeled a war criminal and they called it a day, that this is an attempt to kind of use law to deal with violators rather than straight politics. Okay, so as people are working together, partly through the Nuremberg trials and sort of this application of law, helped lead to the Western European Union in 1947, and then this set down a foundation to evolve into what we know as the EU today.